difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will.
Very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence. I pray that his family can find comfort in the memory of all he tried to do for the land he loved so well.
And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
When King took the pulpit of the Bishop Charles Mason Temple on April 3rd, he sought to rally his supporters for a peaceful march, then scheduled for April 9th. He warned against the violence that had marred a previous protest, lest violence overshadow the justice of the Union's cause. Nearing the close of his address, he recurred to his vision of the Promised Land and of the peace that vision had brought him. This was not the first time King had prophesied his own death, but it would be the last.
Eyewitnesses to the assassination say that Dr. King left his room 306 at the Lorraine Hotel just before dinner to get some air. He walked over to the railing at this spot, and noticing some friends below, he leaned over and began to speak with them. Police say 205 feet away, in a window in a flop house, the assassin waited. He waited, police believe, in a bathroom down the hall from the room he rented but 4 hours earlier. To get a clear shot of his victim, the assassin apparently had to stand in the bathtub, leaning forward to brace his arms on the window ledge to steady his rifle. And this was the view he got. He fired a single shot, hitting his target squarely, and then he ran. Out of the bathroom and along the decrepit hallway, turning, he raced down the rickety wood stairs and out. One policeman said he simply faded. Ike Pappas, CBS News, Memphis.
How many here believe that James Earl Ray acted alone in the killing of Martin Luther King? I'm sorry, but it's such a grim question, but it's an important one. He acted alone. I have to see hands. How many believe there was a conspiracy and that he was not? Oh, my goodness. James Earl Ray's brother, Jerry Ray, one of his two younger brothers, is at hand. Mr. Ray, tell me what we don't know about the assassination of Martin Luther King that you do know. Maybe you can give us a headline here.
Well, a lot of things I don't know, but I know one thing, that he was directed in that there was a lot of people involved in it, but I wasn't involved in it in no way.
You had nothing at all to do with the assassination of Martin Luther King?
I hadn't talked to him about 3 months before the assassination took place.
Yeah. Do you think your brother pulled the trigger that killed the civil rights?
No, sir, I don't think it. And they had experts that analyzed his voice saying that he didn't assassinate King.
You know that the famous attorney Percy Foreman quotes your brother as saying that you, Jerry, was with him at the time he bought the gun.
But he didn't say that until after my brother filed a libel suit against him. Before that, he wasn't talking that way, but then...
okay, but it's not likely that Percy Foreman, a man of wealth and reputation, would make...
And a professional crook.
You think he is?
He was indicted in Texas for extortion, I think it was.
Well, those charges have not been litigated, and I still don't know if I understand what would motivate Percy Foreman to lie.
Now, once he goes ahead and he's apprehended and he stands trial, all right, I said Percy Foreman comes in and basically sells him down the river, all right? And about, I think it's 24 to 48 hours after he has his mini trial where they recite the evidence against him, and Foreman didn't object to anything. The only guy who said anything was Ray. All right, when the judge said, you know, do you want to say anything? He says, well, yes, I would. And he goes, well, what is it? He goes, well, I just want to get it on the record that I do not agree with the theories of Mr. Hoover or Mr. Clark. And he says, who's Mr. Clark? Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General. I just want to make it clear I don't believe what their theories are saying. All right, and that's the only thing that he says on his behalf during the entire mini trial. It was really no trial at all because Foreman didn't put on, didn't do anything.
Defense.
Yeah, he didn't say anything. All right, during the whole thing. All right, and so about 48 hours after the trial, Ray realizes what happens to him, and he writes a letter to the judge saying, I would like to reconsider everything that just happened. I don't think I was represented well. And in a very, very puzzling happenstance that could only happen in the movies, the judge, Preston Battle, is actually reading his plea on his desk, and he's about to go ahead and sign it, and he had a heart attack and died.
Oh, come on. Come on.
I said it's out of a movie, all right? So there went the last best chance, for...
He just collapsed?
Right. Yeah, it was right on his desk when they found his body. All right.
Oh, you mean in his private office, not
Yeah.
in front, not.
Yeah, in his private office.
Well, so they said it was a heart attack.
Well,
there was nobody in the room with him.
No, nobody really knows
He
what happened.
apparently
but
died from a heart attack.
That's what happened. All right. And so James Earl Ray wasn't allowed. Now, let me tell you something else. In that kind of a situation, all right, when you're in the process of reapplying, for a rehearing, et cetera, and something happens, and you're supposed to be able to refile it later. Well, what they did is when James Earl Ray finally got a good lawyer, William Pepper, all right, the Tennessee legislature changed the law. So he couldn't get a new trial. All right, that's how determined they were.
Yeah, but if they change the law, that doesn't go retroactive.
Yeah, they made it retroactively. Okay, they couldn't do it. All right, that's how
shades of our current administration.
Yeah, right. So
we didn't break the law; we changed it.
Right. So what happens is he doesn't get to use that part of the law to go ahead and get a new trial. Now, what happens later is that years down the line, James Earl Ray finally gets an attorney who's willing to take his case for nothing and go ahead and argue and trying to get him a new trial. And this guy's name is Bill Pepper. Who's
William Pepper.
William Pepper. Right.
He has his own history. He's a notable personage at the time.
Right. He's an American who moved to England, all right, and he did a lot of really good things with King when he was alive. All right. It was supposed to be Pepper who actually got King interested in the Vietnam War when he did this article for Ramparts magazine.
Under the terms of the law, James Earl Ray is guilty of killing Martin Luther King Jr. In March of 1969, he entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. At the trial, the district attorney told the court that he had a witness who saw Ray run from this bathroom from which the killing shot was fired, down this hallway toward the stairs. Outside the building, and just a few feet down the street in front of this store, a bundle was discovered. In the bundle, there was a rifle with one fired cartridge casing in the chamber. Ray's fingerprints were on the rifle, and it was of the same caliber as that used in the assassination. Also in the bundle were several other items, including binoculars and some clothing that belonged to James Earl Ray. Ray acknowledges that he was in Memphis, that he bought the rifle, that the other items in the bundle were his, and even the fact that he rented a room in the boarding house, number 5, just down the hallway from the bathroom from which the shot was fired.
And so now you have to believe that the place that he chose to kill King was a public restroom, because they didn't have restrooms in the actual rooms.
Yeah.
It was a communal, a public restroom. Now,
that's where he supposedly fired from.
right, on top of a bathtub. to get through the window, there's been pictures taken, a French magazine, they actually sent a guy in there to see if they could go ahead and take the shot that was supposed to kill King. They had to have the guy, and I've seen the picture, you would have to be a gymnast, you know, to contort yourself in the position to go ahead and fire through the top of that window, you know, and kill King. Now, on top of that, of course, if you're in a public restroom, you don't know who's waiting outside. Somebody could be waiting outside, you know, and sees you, you know, run right out with you happen to have a rifle in your hand, etc. But this is a story we have to believe that Ray did this. And the capper to this story is that supposedly after King is shot, Ray goes into his room, grabs all his things, stuffs them into a briefcase, runs down the stairs, okay, jumps into his car, but before he jumps into the car, he drops the briefcase and leaves it in front of this five and dime store called Knief's, including all this incriminating stuff about, you know, the camera, okay, the beer can with his fingerprints on it, etc., all this other stuff that he bought. You know, as Mark Lane said, you know, if James Earl Ray did that, he should be not guilty by reason of insanity, all right, for, you know, to go ahead and do that. Now, it came out later at the civil trial, which Pepper managed to push on towards after he couldn't get the evidentiary hearing with Judge Joe Brown. He had a civil trial against a guy named Lloyd Jowers, who had that tavern that we were talking about next to Bessie's boarding house, all right. It came out that the guy who owned that five and dime store,
Where they found the suitcase.
he told his son that that case was there 10 minutes before the shooting.
The official version of what happened here at the Lorraine Motel that day, put forward by Memphis police and the FBI, was that as Dr. King stood here on the balcony outside his room, leaned over to talk to someone below, a shot was fired from a rooming house across the street and just over 200 feet away, a shot fired by James Earl Ray. But now Lloyd Jowers wants to come forward and say it didn't happen that way. The new story is that the shot was fired from somewhere down below, perhaps as close as that row of bushes just above the wall, and not fired by James Earl Ray, but instead by a new shooter that Jowers had been asked to hire. According to Jowers, the man who asked him to help in the killing of Dr. King was a now-deceased Memphis produce dealer named Frank Liberto.
Liberto done me several large favors, so I owed him a favor.
What did Frank Liberto ask you to do?
He asked me to handle some money transactions, hire someone to assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King.
To kill Dr. King?
Yes, sir. He asked me if I knew someone. I told him I thought I knew someone who would probably do it.
I wound up being the last judge hearing the James Earl Ray matter. Did he, in fact, assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King? And had he not died and his local attorney not died in close succession, it would have been my finding that he was not the gunman. That Remington 760 Game Master they've got in the Civil Rights Museum is not the murder weapon. It's not even close. And it was a two-man hit team that killed him from the fire station dormitory. It wasn't the flop house, and it wasn't in those bushes. So, yeah, I got into the deep details of Dr. King, and that 3 or 4 year period, that case was kicking around in front of me. It's interesting, the homicide file for the Memphis Police Department reaches the same conclusion back in 1968. They entered their file in protest to the DA's office. Their conclusion was Ray is not the gunman. He was not even in Memphis that day. We know conclusively where he was.
A comparison was conducted of the bullet material removed from Dr. King with the 12 test bullets that could be adequately analyzed. This comparison revealed that the gross and unique characteristic signature left on the 12 test bullets by the James Earl Ray rifle was not present on the death bullet.
What's the emotion when you come back?
It's like pulling the scab off of a wound. It's just raw. It's not healed. It hurts. It's so wrong. He was so young and so strong. He had so much meaning, so much life left to live, so much more to give, and yet they just killed him. And our government did not protect him. Matter of fact, our government sought to disgrace and discredit him. Our government have set the climate for his being killed.
James Earl Ray, who was convicted of killing Dr. King, why have you said before you believe he didn't act alone?
He didn't have the money, the motive, or the organization skills to do it. A lone killer getting out of town at 6 o'clock, getting into Mississippi and all that, end up in London. He couldn't have done that by himself.
What do you think happened?
The government was very involved.
In 1997, Dexter King, the son of Martin Luther King Jr., met with James Earl Ray and asked him, "I just want to ask you, for the record, did you kill my father?" Ray told King that he hadn't been responsible for the assassination of his father, and this led to the King family filing a civil suit in 1999 against Lloyd Jowers. Jowers had appeared on ABC's Primetime Live, where he claimed to have conspired with the federal government and the mafia to kill Martin Luther King Jr. The jury in the case of Coretta Scott King versus Lloyd Jowers, which was made up of 6 blacks and 6 whites, decided that the Memphis police and federal agency had conspired to murder Martin Luther King. The King family's belief that James Earl Ray had been innocent endures, with the Washington Post reporting in March 2018 that "it pains my heart," said Bernice King, 55, the youngest of Martin Luther King's 4 children and the executive director of the King Center in Atlanta, that James Earl Ray had to spend his life in prison paying for things he didn't do.
It's not off the cuff, just, oh, let's go do it. This was planned out.
Correct.
With many people involved.
Right. And then the guy who's actually standing over his body, Merrill McCullough, who's supposed to be a part of this invaders group, which is modeled on the Black Panthers. Okay, there's a famous picture of King, and this guy's standing over his dead body. Okay, and he's pointing at where James Earl Ray is supposed to be. Okay, across the street. All right, and this kid's name is Merrill McCullough, and like I said, he had been supposedly part of this group called the Invaders, modeled on the Black Panthers. It turns out that Merrill McCullough had been an informant for the Memphis Police Department, had been working for the FBI also. When Sam Donaldson heard about this, okay, he says, "You're not going to tell me," like smiling, "that this Merrill, you're not going to say Merrill McCullough works for the Central Intelligence Agency, do you?" And they said, "That's what we're saying." So on national TV, Sam Donaldson calls up CIA headquarters, okay, and he gets the desk officer there, and he goes, "Do you have a man named Merrill McCullough that works there?" And the guy doesn't know what's happening, so he looks at the roster and he goes, "Let's see. Yeah, we do." Because, "Do you mind if I talk to him?" So McCullough comes to the telephone, and Donaldson asks, "Are you the Merrill McCullough who's in that famous picture of Martin Luther King when he's dying on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel?" And he goes, "Yes." And he goes, "And you work for the Central Intelligence Agency?" And he goes, "Yes." "How long have you worked for the CIA?" 17 years. All right. So now we have the guy standing over King's that pointing to the wrong place. We now know was an undercover agent. Okay. All these years, we weren't allowed to know that. Okay. Now, why that's important is because the reason he ends up in Memphis at all is because the invaders had broken up his first demonstration in Memphis. Okay, for the sanitation workers there. He'd been down there in late March. The invaders break up that demonstration. Okay, they start throwing cans through windows, etc. And that's what brings him back, because he felt so bad that it turned out so badly that's why he comes back.
On New Year's Day 1976, part 1 of a 2-part New York Times article was published entitled "Study of Dr. King's Death Finds No Link to FBI." The article started off by stating, "For nearly 8 years, the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has puzzled many private citizens and even some government officials who were skeptical that James Earl Ray, an escaped convict with no obvious antipathy towards the black civil rights leader, had been the lone assassin, despite Mr. Ray's own admission of guilt in court."
In fact, the previous November, a Senate Select Committee on Intelligence had disclosed that the FBI had waged a significant campaign for at least 6 years to discredit Martin Luther King. On the 21st of November 1964, the FBI sent the infamous suicide letter to Dr. King's residence, which also contained a tape recording of King having sexual relations with a woman other than his wife. The New York Times' Beverly Gage reported in 2014 that the so-called suicide letter had occupied a unique place in history of American intelligence, the most notorious and embarrassing example of Hoover's FBI run amok. The festering wound, which was the assassination of Martin Luther King, was to linger long in the memory, and it would be J. Stanley Pottinger who was put in charge of investigating federal wrongdoing. The department's re-examination of the case continues, but J. Stanley Pottinger, head of the Civil Rights Division, said in an interview that so far his inquiry had turned up no evidence whatever of FBI involvement in the killing. Pottinger also asked the FBI not to comment publicly on the case, saying that it may negatively affect James Earl Ray's appeal. But in 1976, the flawed investigation into FBI involvement in the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't the only high-profile assassination which Assistant Attorney General Stanley Pottinger was involved with.
To protect our men who are in Vietnam, and to guarantee the continued success of our withdrawal and Vietnamization programs, I have concluded that the time has come for action.
At the end of April and on the first day of May, American and South Vietnamese forces began crossing the frontiers of Cambodia.
Tear gas first started down the commons, then the guard moved up on both sides of Taylor Hall and forced the kids off the commons. Then one group, I don't know how many there were, 50 maybe, perhaps more, perhaps less, moved down to the practice football field.
After you feed them, then what will we do? Will you ask them to leave?
They've got grievances, they've got demands. There are demands on both sides. We have to talk.
And then there were a whole lot of kids around them. A few kids were throwing sticks and stones, but that was only a handful, not more than 10, 15. And then the guard shot some tear gas up on the hill to disperse the crowd, and the kids picked it up and threw it back.
File. Guard will make a perimeter, a circle, right out in here. From the right, move out. It's got a big circle around here.
You don't talk during a state of emergency, Mike. You know that. Come on.
I'm sorry, but
We'll
I don't
talk
want
as
people
soon as
shot.
we get this
I
settled
don't
down.
want people shot on this campus, just as a citizen of this campus.
Who wants people
All
shot?
right, but they're sitting quietly.
Okay, will you ask them to leave?
This area immediately. Leave this area immediately.
And all of a sudden I heard the shooting. And then I saw people dropping to the ground, and then I fell to the ground also, because I couldn't walk anymore.
What the investigators have to determine then is whether indeed there was a sniper and whether the guard was justified in firing its weapons, or whether, as some people here believe, the guard, under the pressure of a rock-throwing attack, panicked and fired its weapons indiscriminately, killing 4 people.
A skirmish line equipped with tear gas, loaded weapons, only most of the students didn't know they were loaded with live ammunition, and fixed bayonets moved the students. Students later claimed we weren't doing anything. Freedom of speech and assembly was being denied. Later, the Scranton Commission and the FBI report agreed that the assembly was peaceful up to this point. The students disperse. Company C leaves, while the rest of the guard pursues students over Blanket Hill. Alison Krauss is visible to the troops for the first time. Barry Levine, whom she had arranged to meet at the rally and was holding her hand when she was shot, recalled that she was crying, not from the tear gas, but from the emotion of what was happening to her, her friends, and her campus. It was all there. The Cambodian announcement, a rally to bury a murdered constitution, destruction of business property in town, repressive restrictions, a burnt-out ROTC building, confusion among enforcement officials, and indiscriminate use of military power against the innocent and guilty. A prelude to murder.
What if I'm from Skaneateles? I'm going to Kent now. And it started out as a 12 o'clock rally, and I didn't know, what was going to happen afterwards. We were just meeting down in the Commons. The crowd followed them. They were yelling at them and throwing rocks. And I ran into Taylor Hall. I was standing in the corner. I pulled back the curtain, and I just saw them crouch down and start firing, and people driving in from there. It was just chaos. And I don't know. I didn't see the people that got shot because, I was running and everyone was running and yelling, and I can't.
Why do you think the guard opened fire?
Well, I don't know. I think they just lost control of the thing. I don't know. They were being hit with rocks. Did you see any snipers? No, I didn't see. The only thing I saw was when they turned around and crouched down and started shooting. And I don't know what started, all I can say is that they were being hit with rocks, and it just looked like they lost control and started firing. They didn't warn them or anything that they were going to fire. They just shot.
During the stay on the practice field, some of the guardsmen huddled together. These are members of Troop G, whose members were the first to fire. General Canterbury orders the men to march back up Blanket Hill. Troop G is on the right flank. Members of Troop G keep looking back toward the parking lot. Alan Canfori was later shot and wounded. Some rocks are still being thrown, but they are fewer now. These students are about 100 feet away from the guardsmen. Joseph Lewis is the closest person to the guard, except for those who are observing from Taylor Hall. The Scranton Commission later concluded the guards' march from Blanket Hill to the football field and back did not disperse the crowd and seems to have done little else than increase tension, subject guardsmen to needless abuse, and encourage the most violent and irresponsible elements in the crowd to harass the guard further. General Canterbury later testified, as the troop formation reached the area of the pagoda, the mob, located on the right flank in front of Taylor Hall and in the Prentice Hall parking lot, charged our right flank, throwing rocks, yelling obscenities and threats. Stick the pigs, kill the pigs. He continued, practically all the guardsmen were hit by missiles. Guardsmen on the right flank were in serious danger of bodily harm and death as the mob continued to charge. He concluded, in view of the extreme danger, they were justified in firing.
President, in the light of the Kent State University incident, could you tell us what, in your judgment, is the proper action and conduct for a police force or a National Guard force when ordered to clear a campus area and faced with a crowd throwing rocks?
We think we've done a rather good job here in Washington in that respect. As you note, we handled the two demonstrations, October 15th and November 15th of last year, without any significant casualties. And that took a lot of doing because there were some pretty rough people involved. A few were rough. Most of them were very peaceful. I would hope that the experience that we have had in that respect could be shared by the National Guards, which of course are not under federal control, but under state control. Now, what I say is not to be interpreted as a criticism in advance of my getting the facts of the National Guards at Kent State. I want to know what the facts are. I've asked for the facts, and when I get them, I'll have something to say about it. But I do know that when you do have a situation of a crowd throwing rocks, and the National Guard is called in, that there is always the chance that it will escalate into the kind of a tragedy that happened at Kent State. And if there's one thing I am personally committed to, it's this. I saw the pictures of those 4 youngsters in the Evening Star the day after that tragedy. And I vowed then that we were going to find methods that would be more effective to deal with these problems of violence, methods that would deal with those who would use force and violence and endanger others, but at the same time would not take the lives of innocent people.
But Nixon's disdain for protesters had been a reoccurring theme throughout his presidency. The issue came up in the Watergate hearings too.
I was made aware of the president's strong feelings about even the smallest of demonstrations during the late winter of 1971, when the president happened to look out the window of the residence of the White House and saw a lone man with a large 10-foot sign stretched out in front of Lafayette Park. Mr. Higbee called me to his office to tell me that the president's displeasure with the sign in the park, and told me that Mr. Haldeman had said that the sign had to come down. When I came out of Mr. Higbee's office, I ran into Dwight Chapin, who said he was going to get some thugs to remove the man from Lafayette Park. He said it would take him a few hours to get them, but they could do the job. I told him I didn't believe that was necessary.
In the conclusion of the Kent State part of the report, it states, "The guard fired amidst great turmoil and confusion, engendered in part by their own activities. But the guardsmen should not have been able to kill so easily in the first place. The general issuance of loaded weapons to law enforcement officers engaged in controlling disorders is never justified except in the case of armed resistance that trained sniper teams are unable to handle. This was not the case at Kent State, yet each guardsman carried a loaded M1 rifle." This lesson is not new. The National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders and the guidelines of the Department of the Army set it out explicitly. No one would have died at Kent State if this lesson had been learned by the Ohio National Guard. Even if the guardsmen faced danger, it was not a danger that called for lethal force. The 61 shots by 28 guardsmen certainly cannot be justified. Apparently, no order to fire was given. As the Scranton Commission were investigating Kent State, so were the authorities. These young victims of the Kent State massacre were only 19 and 20 years old. This had been a tragedy, and they risked being forgotten. The Scranton Commission seemed to be successful in its aim to draw a line under Kent State. But by 1973, the case was being reopened. On the 18th of June 1973, an Ohio newspaper, the Newark Advocate, published an article entitled "Caution Urged on Kent." It read, "A top-level Justice Department official has cautioned against false expectations that his reopening of files on the May 1970 Kent State student shootings will lead to a federal grand jury probe. But Assistant Attorney General John Stanley Pottinger, who heads the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, confirmed that since April he has been reviewing the shootings of 4 Kent State students. He said he will conclude his review within a month. All I can tell you now is that I want to do a responsible job of the review, and that takes some time," the former Dayton resident said during his first news conference since he took over his job in February. Despite his lengthy open statement, in which the Kent State inquiry was not mentioned, the majority of questions focused on speculation that he and Attorney General Elliot L. Richardson will reverse former Attorney John Mitchell's 1971 decision against convening a federal grand jury. Pottinger said his review of the case, revealed in a June 1st letter from Richardson to Kent State President Glenn Olds, does not signal a determination that it was wrongly closed initially. It does not mean that expectations on the part of anybody of either side of that issue should be raised or changed, he said. Again, it was going to be John Stanley Pottinger who cleaned up another controversial issue.
I was hit in the left heel, and it just took the right side of my left foot off.
Now a history professor, Grace wrote Kent State, Death and Dissent in the long 60s, which looked at what happened and why. He and others maintained that an audio recording, reanalyzed in 2007, contains evidence of an order to fire. 8 guardsmen were indicted in 1973 for their involvement, but the case was thrown out the following year. Grace is among a group that believes the federal investigation into the shootings should be reopened, even 50 years later.
So it helps us to understand better what took place there, and that there was some degree of foresight on the part of the National Guard in terms of what they did. The National Guard always maintained that they fired in defense of their lives.
Well, going back to 1970, at the time the National Guard fired 67 gunshots into our crowd of unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9, including me. There was always a big mystery. Why did they shoot? The commanding officers on the scene all denied giving a verbal order to fire, and they claimed that the individual guardsmen, out of a total of 76 guardsmen on the hilltop, about 28 of them fired their guns, about a dozen fired into the crowd. But the big mystery always was there an order to fire or not? So many of us have been trying to do the research down through the years, and just recently I had the very good luck to find literally a needle in a haystack. I found a key bit of evidence that's been overlooked for 37 years. It turned out to be located inside of a tape recording made by a student on May 4th, 1970. A student named Terry Struby had the foresight to put a reel-to-reel tape recorder by his window of his dormitory, and he put the microphone on the windowsill, and he went outside, and he thought he would record the sounds of a rally. Well, it turned out the guardsmen fired tear gas. They chased us over a hill, and after about 24 minutes of a confrontation, when they finally marched back up a hilltop, it looked like they were retreating, but suddenly, out of 76 guardsmen, about a dozen guardsmen altogether on the right flank stopped, turned, raised their weapons, and they began to shoot, mostly M1 rifles, which are very deadly, powerful weapons, right into the crowd. I was a witness. I was down near the bottom of the hill about 225 feet away. I got shot through my wrist, but more importantly, I think I was an eyewitness. I saw those guys stop, turn, raise their weapons, and all begin to shoot, and then continue to shoot 67 shots during 13 seconds. I assumed immediately there was an order to fire, but then we went through all these court cases, and the officers denied giving the order. Well, finally, I found the proof.
Well, why didn't anyone find this before?
We did get a version of that tape. The 13 seconds of gunfire was presented in our court cases in the 1970s, but they only digitized at that time. I'm talking about the U.S. Justice Department. And of course, we know that back in 1970, the Justice Department was dominated by J. Edgar Hoover, who was basically a criminal. So we're not surprised to think that back then J. Edgar Hoover may have suppressed this information, but more likely what our attorneys are saying is at the time of our trial in 1975, they only had an analog tape, which was one of those little cassettes. And that's what's been sitting in the Yale library all these decades. And when I contacted Yale and I noticed online they had a copy of the Struby tape, I called the Yale archivist. I said, is it possible to get a copy and a CD? She says, yes, we can make you one for $10. So as soon as I got my hands on that CD, I put it in my computer, which had very modest speakers, not exactly top-notch speakers or anything. And I got to the point, it's about a 29-minute tape, but when I got to near the end of the tape, I knew the shooting sequence would be coming. I knew that would be a difficult moment to hear that. But I was just stunned when I heard the verbal command to fire immediately before the shootings. What I heard was this: right here, get set, point, fire, and then the 13 seconds of gunfire.
Wow. And that just totally goes against the official story, is that right?
Well, it certainly blows away the cover-up. The National Guard leadership at the time, on the hilltop there, at the moment of the shootings, there was a general, there was a lieutenant colonel, and there was a major. And we have their courtroom testimony under oath. We have their sworn depositions. We have their federal grand jury testimony. We have numerous examples of them swearing oaths and to tell the truth, and they all deny giving the order. But clearly, it's a militaristic command, shouted in a very militaristic way, and it's not like it's something that was whispered or just stated. It was a shouted military command.
A Miami News article on Friday, November the 8th, 1974, announced that 8 Kent State Guardsmen were acquitted by a U.S. judge. The article states, in Washington, J. Stanley Pottinger, Assistant Attorney General of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, said, "We felt that the case should have been decided by a jury instead of the judge. With that ruling, we are disappointed. But we are not disappointed with our efforts to see that justice was done. The department has done everything in its power to air the causes of this tragedy and to enforce the law. The court's ruling today ends the federal government's prosecution in the Kent State case. This is subject only to a remote possibility of an appeal which, in any event, appears to be precluded as a matter of law." In May 2007, the Tampa Bay Times reported on Alan Canfora's finding of the audio recording of the order to fire. It states, the reel-to-reel audio recording was made by a student who placed a microphone at a windowsill of his dormitory, Canfora said. Stan Pottinger, who helped prosecute the guardsman when he was Assistant Attorney General with the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, said Tuesday he doubts anything was overlooked then. He said that he could not specifically recall the tape, but that audio recordings and films were carefully studied. Canfora said only a small portion of tape was reviewed during various investigations. Regardless of what we know now, the Kent State grand jury proceedings were considered successful at the time, and Stanley Pottinger was seen as being at the center of that success. Even though J. Stanley Pottinger kept putting his hand in the fire, he never seemed to get burnt.
People will look back to the generation of the 1970s at how we've conducted ourselves. And they will say, God bless America. Thank you very much.
We believe that peace is at hand in a matter of weeks or less.
Tonight, I would like to give my answer to those who have suggested that I resign. I have no intention whatever of walking away from the job I was elected to do. I have never heard or seen such outrageous, vicious, distorted reporting in 27 years of public life. I'm not blaming anybody for that. I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I burned everything I've got.
The Tonight Show will not be seen tonight, so that we may bring you the following NBC News special report.
Mr. Cox's comment when he was told that he was apparently about to be fired was, "Whether ours shall continue to be a government of laws and not of men is now for Congress and ultimately the American people."
An investigator appointed to investigate scandals was fired because he insisted on investigating scandals.
The president may have an even more grave constitutional crisis on his hands.
In my career as a correspondent, I never thought I'd be announcing these things.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen.
Astonishing thing is happening here. He is getting an applause, not necessarily from the reporters, but from the Justice Department employees who are, as you see, lining the balcony. This is unusual.
In the back of the room now, and then did you order the FBI to take over the offices on Saturday night? And if so, why?
Guilty.
Amid this chaos,
the White House failed to carry out its plan to dismiss Cox's staff. So, the rest of the prosecution staff sat tight.
The White House announced last night that you were abolished. Now, when did you begin to get word that you weren't abolished?
You know, the White House announced we were abolished, but if they announce the sky is green and then you look up and the sky is blue, now I presume that in the normal course of events that to abolish an agency takes some time. We are going to try like hell. We are a criminal prosecution force. We have reason to believe there's been some serious crime, and we want to prosecute it.
In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, including some of my closest friends and most trusted aides, have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair. I first learned from news reports of the Watergate break-in. I was appalled at this senseless, illegal action. And I was shocked to learn that employees of the Re-election Committee were apparently among those guilty.
I condemn any attempts to cover up in this case, no matter who is involved.
Well, his reaction is that since he did nothing wrong, was not part of the cover-up, that little purpose would be served in stepping aside.
Today, in one of the most difficult decisions of my presidency, I accepted the resignations of two of my closest associates in the White House, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, two of the finest public servants it has been my privilege to know. The House Judiciary Committee has just approved its first article of impeachment against President Nixon.
Yeah. And that's an NBC camera, I presume. I know. Standard joke. Let me see that. You get these lights properly. My eyes always have. You'll find if they get past 60, that's enough. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body.
I don't believe that I ought to quit, because I'm not a quitter. And incidentally, Pat's not a quitter. After all, her name was Patricia Ryan, and she was born on St. Patrick's Day, and you know the Irish never quit.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
But the greatness comes, and you're really tested, when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule.
The apparent certainty of the president's imminent resignation raised two big questions on Capitol Hill. What to do about the impeachment, and should Mr. Nixon be granted immunity from criminal prosecution? Bruce Morton reports on the House.
Some members of Congress say that unless the president's resignation includes some confession of guilt, the impeachment process should continue. But that decision is up to the leaders of the House.
I feel if the president resigned, that should be the end of the impeachment proceedings. This should put an end to the Watergate affair as an issue involving incumbent public officials.
Former White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman found guilty today on 5 counts in the Watergate cover-up trial. Former White House Domestic Affairs Advisor John Ehrlichman, 4 counts, guilty. John Mitchell, former Attorney General and head of the Nixon Re-election Committee, 5 counts, guilty. Robert Mardian, former political coordinator for the Re-election Committee, 1 count, guilty. Kenneth Parkinson, lawyer for the Re-election Committee, 2 counts, the only defendant found not guilty. The verdict came 2.5 years after the Watergate break-in and 13.5 weeks after the trial began. In those weeks, more than 12,000 pages of transcript were accumulated as more than 80 witnesses appeared, and 34 of those famous White House tapes were played. CBS News correspondents Fred Graham and Jed Duval were at the trial from its beginning October 1st until its end late today. Fred, first, what about the case against H.R. Haldeman?
Well, the case against Haldeman was the strongest of all because as Richard Nixon's right-hand man, he was the one most often recorded on the tapes, and they destroyed him. The most damaging was the conversation with Mr. Nixon on June 23, 1972, in which they agreed to use the CIA to block the FBI's investigation of Watergate. It was enough to force Richard Nixon from the presidency, but Haldeman told the jury they didn't do it to cover up Watergate, but just to avoid political embarrassment.
How long have you held your present position?
I've been in Tehran since the middle of March of this year.
And prior to that, were you the director of the Central Intelligence Agency?
Yes, I was the director of Central Intelligence was my title.
How long were you director?
Approximately 6.5 years. I believe I was sworn in on June the 30th, 1966, and I left office when Mr. Schlesinger became director on the 2nd of February, 1973.
How long have you been, or were you, with the Central Intelligence Agency?
From the day its doors opened in 1947.
Ambassador Helms, I'd like now to direct your attention to June of 1972 and ask you, when for the first time did you hear of the break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate?
It's my impression that I heard about it, read about it in the newspapers or heard it on the radio. But this is not any lapse of memory. This is just one of those things that this far back it's hard to know just exactly who might have told me or how I might have heard it. Certainly it was big news from the moment it happened.
And during the days immediately following the break-in, were there conversations at the CIA concerning the break-in?
Yes, in the first place, sometime on that weekend, I received a telephone call from Mr. Howard Osborne, the Director of Security, to inform me that of the names of the individuals who had participated in the break-in, and also to say that Mr. Hunt, in some fashion, was connected with it. Mr. Osborne's call to me was a perfectly routine matter. There was a charge on him as Director of Security to inform me whenever anybody in the agency got in any kind of trouble, whether they're present employees or past employees. In other words, right now, so that I didn't have to catch up with these events like suicides and house break-ins and rapes and the various things that happen to the employees of any organization in a city like Washington. So this was a perfectly routine thing, and when he heard about these ex-CIA people who had been involved in this burglary, he called me up and notified me about it. On Monday, when I came to the office, there'd been no mention in the papers of Mr. Hunt, so I got a hold of Mr. Osborne and said, how come you told me that Mr. Hunt was involved with this? And he said, well, there was some papers found in the hotel room, or one of the hotel rooms was Hunt's name on it, and it looks as though he was somewhere in the area when the break-in took place. So I said, all right. And then from then on, obviously, there were various conversations in the agency as we went to work on various requests from the FBI for information about the people and their background and so forth that had formerly been employed by the agency.
Am I correct that James McCord also was a former employee of the agency?
He was.
And when did Mr. McCord and Mr. Hunt leave the employ of the agency?
They left it at different times in 1970. They both retired, as I recall it.
Now, directing your attention to June 22nd, 1972, which was the day before your meeting with Mr. Ehrlichman, Mr. Haldeman, and General Walters at the White House, did you have a conversation with Patrick Gray on that afternoon, namely the afternoon of June 22nd?
I believe that the committee is in possession of a memorandum which says that, or a memorandum or a note from Mr. Gray that says I had this conversation. I have no reason to question that at all. I was talking back and forth with Mr. Gray at various times in connection with this Watergate break-in, so I have no reason to doubt that there was one on the 22nd of June.
In these conversations, did you discuss the possibility of CIA involvement in the break-in?
I assured Mr. Gray that the CIA had no involvement in the break-in, no involvement whatever. And it was my preoccupation consistently from then to this time to make this point and to be sure that everybody understands it. It doesn't seem to get across very well for some reason, but the agency had nothing to do with the Watergate break-in. I hope all the newspaper men in the room hear me clearly now.
Mr. Ambassador, what were Hunt's areas of work at the CIA?
Senator Gurney, he was with the agency for many years and had a variety of assignments.
You might pull that mic over.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't move it over to you. I beg your pardon.
Thank you.
I had a variety of assignments, and I honestly think it would be putting my memory to too much of a test to remember what they all were. I remember there was one that he had some assignment in connection with the operations leading up to the so-called Bay of Pigs. But this is readily available in the agency. You could get his personnel record, and then it would be accurate.
Oh, I'm not interested in a detailed account. I wondered if his areas were in the sort of work that he was doing on June 17th.
It would be hard for me to recall. I don't. I just don't remember.
How often does the CIA help out former employees in the loan of equipment, as in the case of Mr. Hunt?
Well, I can only say, Senator Gurney, that this was an extraordinary exception. And it was done because we had been asked to do it by the White House.
Has it ever been done before, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
Well, has it, do you think it has been done before without your knowledge?
This is always possible, Senator Gurney. It's a large organization. I would hope not, but I can't say that it had never been done. No, of course not.
But at least no other CIA person has said to you that, yes, we did this on some other occasion with so-and-so.
I don't recall that having been said to me.
Well, since this was such an unusual request, why did the CIA go ahead and cooperate with Hunt?
Well, General Cushman had already authorized this, as I understood it at the time, on the basis of Mr. Ehrlichman having asked that the agency help. At that time, as I recall it, Mr. General Cushman was simply told that this was for him to conduct an interview. We had no way of knowing whether this was an interview in the United States or an interview overseas. It had already been done by the time I learned about it. And
What was your reaction when Cushman told you?
Well, I was not pleased about it, because I didn't quite understand why it was that he couldn't have acquired these things someplace else.
Well, I must say that same thought occurs to me. If these were routine items of apparatus, the White House certainly would have resources enough to get those themselves.
I would have thought so, Senator Gurney. I have learned when I came back here in May that there were some other things given to him, such as a voice changer or something, and I believe a wig has become almost legendary in this whole matter, but I don't recall anything about the wig at the time, but I don't question that it was done.
Even though Nixon had stepped aside, the Watergate scandal was still in the news. The New York Times published an article on the 20th of February 1976 entitled "Helms Won't Face Break-In Charge," which stated that Assistant Attorney General J. Stanley Pottinger, head of the department's Civil Rights Division, said he and other officials had carefully weighed evidence to prosecute Mr. Helms for a civil rights violation. However, Mr. Pottinger told a news conference his congressional testimony is under review for possible perjury charges. With a Nixonian man like Pottinger in charge, the former director of the CIA, Richard Helms, appeared safe from prosecution over Watergate. Helms had also denied to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that CIA had conducted domestic surveillance or supported political foes of the late President Salvador Allende Gossens of Chile. In the latter New York Times article, it reads, Mr. Pottinger defended the decision not to prosecute Mr. Helms and others involved in the burglary of a photo studio in suburban Fairfax City, VA. That was partly owned by a CIA employee. I had the lead responsibility in the case for the last few months, Mr. Pottinger said. We have spared no resources, no time and no effort. I myself interviewed Mr. Helms. In fact, Mr. Helms was probably delighted to have been interviewed by J. Stanley Pottinger, a man with an abundance of links to the CIA. But there was still even more to discover about J. Stanley Pottinger's involvement in Watergate. In 2005, Bob Woodward, one of the original Washington Post journalists to unravel large parts of the Watergate scandal, released his own book. In The Secret Man, Woodward doesn't only reveal the identity of the Washington Post's main source, known as Deep Throat, for Watergate as being the former FBI's Deputy Director W. Mark Felt, he also explained Pottinger's vital role in hiding this information. Woodward explains that in 1976, the then Assistant Attorney General Stanley Pottinger had revealed to him that Felt had given his secret identity away while testifying before a grand jury. The Washington Post reported in June 2005 that, asked were you Deep Throat, Felt initially said no, but his stunned look alerted Pottinger to the possibility he was lying. The same article also states, in that grand jury proceeding, Woodward writes, Pottinger quietly reminded Felt that he was under oath. He then offered to withdraw the question as irrelevant to the subject of investigation, which was the illegal break-ins conducted by the FBI in pursuit of anti-war radicals from the Weather Underground. Felt quickly accepted the offer. Pottinger told Woodward, who didn't confirm or deny his conclusion, that he would keep his knowledge to himself. To his credit, Woodward writes, he did just that. Pottinger was a company man. He knew how to keep secrets. He also knew when not to ask questions, and in this case, he even knew to withdraw a certain question from the public record so as to maintain hidden relationships and to protect other company men.
We have tonight one of the strangest stories to come along in a long time. A group of American Indians has taken over the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota, and they have been holding it for nearly a whole day. This afternoon, the FBI said the Indians are in charge of the town.
And you charge a white man premeditated murder. You charge him with second-degree manslaughter. And we ain't going for it anymore. And I know this whole damn town is an armed camp.
Hey, listen, white man. I have had all the bullshit from your race as I can take.
Wilson molested Indians, sometimes threatened them. So before the sun set, we want him out of office, and there will be no trouble.
We are going to reject any kind of condition that pushes us out of the Wounded Knee area until all of the issues of the Oglala Sioux are met.
Well, there's been a lot of accusations made here lately, and one in particular that upsets me is the fact that I am using a goon squad, so to speak. They are respectable and honest citizens of fine living. Well, sharpshooters, come to goon squad. Let's go and get them.
Senators, my morning prayers to the great mystery always include you and your colleagues in Congress, as well as leaders in all governments. It is an honor to come before you as a spokesman for my people, the American Indians of the United States of America. In these United States of America, this great country of ours, we American Indians, we can be anything we want to be, except American Indians. And that is created by the laws of this nation and condoned by its subsidiaries the so-called tribal government, and designed for the Indian to fail, to be expendable, to be eliminated. I take you back in your history. After the American Indian hostiles had been subdued and forcibly confined to Indian reservations, it took approximately 30 years, one generation, for us to adjust and become economically viable. Contrary to what the anthropologists say and what we even ourselves are taught as Indian people. However, allotments were made smaller, our remaining lands were open to homesteading, and we were forced into reducing our livestock. Nevertheless, we made the adjustment again in less than half the aforementioned time, 15 years, and become economically self-sufficient again. But once again, the American Indian was forced into reducing our livestock. The boss farmer concept was instituted. We were told what, when, where, how much, and how little we could grow. This applied to agriculture and our livestock. Again, we recovered in a time span of approximately 15 years. We were so successful in our third recovery that the American Indians enjoyed the finest of economic times, while the rest of the industrialized world was wallowing in the Great Depression. It was then that President Roosevelt introduced the Howard Wheeler Act, better known as the Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA, which institutionalized the so-called tribal governments, which are not one of our institutions, and it is still foreign to us this very day. We have yet to recover.
In 1972, the American Indian Movement sponsored the Trail of Broken Treaties, a caravan to Washington, D.C. Our people came hundreds of miles from all over the country, the old and the young, many tribes, from many Indian nations. We came to protest our living conditions and other indignities, like sterilization of our women. There were many disappointments, but what happened at Arlington Cemetery was the worst. We wanted to hold traditional religious ceremonies at the graves of two of our Indian brothers buried there. Ira Hayes had helped raise the flag at Iwo Jima in World War II, and John Rice, a Korean veteran who they wouldn't bury in an all-white cemetery in the Midwest town where he died. The authorities denied us religious freedom. They said we couldn't hold our ceremonies. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is supposed to protect Indian people, had become the enemy. We took over the building and stayed most of the week. In the end, the government called us militants and said we vandalized the building. They calculated the damage in dollars and cents, but they couldn't compute the heartbreak and loss of dignity and freedom of Indian peoples. After what happened in Washington, the people, especially the Oglala Sioux in South Dakota, began questioning the government's control of their lives and their land, schools, hospitals, and their support of a tribal government that didn't represent the people. They organized a demonstration with the help of American Indian Movement against the brutal killing of Raymond Yellow Thunder at an American Legion Hall in Nebraska. Then Sarah Badhart Bull and a delegation went to the Custer Courthouse in South Dakota to demand justice in the murder of her son Wesley by a white man. Requests were ignored in Custer, and things got out of hand.
Hamatakwepe. Mimalakota. Imagina hão aqui existe hoje pai que lê resapa aqui. Lilo wakan. Mitaki e ate tashunka witko tios pai. Mitaki e ina wambli zuya tios pai. This is a traditional greeting of my people that I am bound to give. This is a traditional greeting of my people that I am bound to give. Albeit, it's a short version. What I said in my own language translated into English thusly.
Hey, listen, white man. Hey, listen. Hey, listen, white man. Hey, listen. I have had all the bullshit from your race as I can take. Hey, listen.
The American Indian Movement, or AIM, was formed in 1968 out of the realization that Native people in our country here suffer a 43-year life expectancy compared to 65 plus for the rest of America. Recognizing that the infant mortality rate amongst Indian people is 5 times the national average. This brought about because of inadequate health care provided on the reservation, legal responsibilities spelled out in treaties never being met. Education, average education per Indian person is 5 years or less, and again, contrary to a legal responsibility that the government of the United States has, as spelled out in various treaties. When we see suicide rates in excess of 20 times the national average, when we see substandard, inadequate housing provided on the reservations for our people, when we continue to see the gross injustices in the courts of America, we're contributing to a fact that the prisons of America are populated by 20, 30, 40% Native people, even though we represent 1/2 of 1% of the total population. When we see these kinds of conditions in 1968, the American Indian Movement formed by Indian people, decisions made by Indian people to bring about corrective changes in American society, and in doing so, then bringing about corrective changes for Indian people and all mankind. One thing we have to understand is that the American Indian Movement is first a spiritual movement. It is said that many are cleansing themselves from within. Many have returned to the old religions of our tribes, the traditional religions of our tribes, away from the confused notions of white civilization that has made us slaves of our unguided lives, and consequently bringing about the total destruction of our civilization, or efforts to totally destroy us. This has not happened. By virtue of the fact that it's a traditional spiritual movement first, and then a political movement second, all tribes have rallied around the American Indian Movement. We have, and it's estimated that 90 to 95% of the total population of close to 1 million Native people in the United States totally support the American Indian Movement. It is said that in Canada we are gaining strong support. It is said that throughout Mexico, throughout Central South America, Native indigenous people who recognize what Wounded Knee represents and recognize what the American Indian Movement represents is standing in our support.
The goals set by AIM leaders were support for the reformation of tribal government, as well as bringing attention to the injustices done to Native American people. Russell Means, as an AIM spokesperson, requested congressional investigations into conditions on all reservations and the corruption of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Means specifically wanted a hearing to take place concerning treaties and treaty rights. News of the takeover reached U.S. Marshals at Pine Ridge, and they placed roadblocks at all entrances to Wounded Knee to prevent access to the area. U.S. Marshals and FBI agents set a total of 6 roadblocks, along with 5 observation points throughout the occupation to keep people from entering or leaving Wounded Knee.
And it's here on Searching for Stanley where we first see Stanley Pottinger in real life. Initially, the government flew in J. Stanley Pottinger to deal with the negotiation process. As Pottinger made his way out to Washington to deal with the crisis, he commented on the situation, stating that he was concerned as a negotiator that the option I represent to negotiate a settlement not involving force has come to an end. These veiled threats from Pottinger came as residents who had been ousted by the insurgents threatened to make a move against the protesters.
By April 24th, a negotiation team returned to Wounded Knee, led by Kent Frizzell. The U.S. government still preferred to negotiate with the AIM forces rather than resort to any aggressive attack. On May 5th, Leonard Garment, consultant to the president, sent a letter to Frank Foolscrow. The letter stated that White House representatives would meet with the Teton Sioux in order to examine the 1868 treaty. This meeting would not take place until the dispossession of Wounded Knee occurred.
Although Frizzell had led the negotiations up until the dispossession of Wounded Knee, it would be J. Stanley Pottinger who would handle the aftermath. The Baltimore Sunday Sun reported on April 8, 1973, Mr. Frizzell, who negotiated the settlement with Indian leaders, said Mr. Pottinger will replace him as the government's primary spokesman once disarmament terms of the agreement are carried out. By Saturday, April 21, 1973, Stanley Pottinger's rhetoric had increased. In an article entitled Optimism at Low Ebb at Knee, it states, Assistant Attorney General Stanley Pottinger painted one of the gloomiest official pictures yet of federal government's chances of dealing peaceably with the Indians who have held off their forces at Wounded Knee for 53 days. The article also states that times for talking with the militants may be ending, and the government would then have to resort to police enforcement. After the standoff at Wounded Knee ended, there would be a lot of police enforcement. 2 years after the occupation, one might ask, why has the government spent more than 2 years and millions of dollars trying to convict these people? Why is the government continuing to prosecute after over 80 cases have been won on acquittal or dismissed by the court? Why has a reign of terror begun in which 11 people have been killed at the Pine Ridge Reservation in the past month alone? Why were over 20 American Indian movement leaders arrested within 48 hours of each other last March?
To me, it's not true. It never was, and it never will be. And I'm brought up to believe that this thing doesn't happen in this world. You know, in this country or the other countries are outside of the world, but not this part of the world. And so it's such a horrible thing that maybe I don't want to believe it. You know, but to me, it's not true. She never died. She still exists. I'm Annie Mae, and that's Kamuk Banks in the dark shirt. We made this statement when we were arrested in November 1975. We are proud of being born Indian. We are tired of watching our people die of injustice in this country. We pledge our lives not to tolerate that abuse anymore. And if we are killed in the struggle, we will die with pride, knowing that our children are that much closer to victory.
She don't want to be beaten by white people. By white men. She'd rather be free in spirit and free in heart for her nation. That's why they found her dead. And that's why the FBI cut her hands off and sent them to Washington, D.C. for fingerprints. And that's why they buried her remains at a Catholic cemetery in the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation with no name on the grave. When they told her family it was Annie Mae, they said, well, she died of exposure. She had froze to death, but no. Independent pathologists found she was shot in the head. Shot in the back of the head, right here. Close range. They found her in a blanket. Half her face was bashed and she had no teeth. That's the kind of attitude Annie Mae didn't want her children to live. She didn't want her children to grow up and face that attitude.
The United States, once again, through its violence-prone attitude, its love of guns, its love of violence, will cause the shedding of blood. It is not over. The deaths of Indian people and our fight for our rights will continue.
In the 3 years following the standoff, Pine Ridge had the highest per capita murder rate in the country, resuming a quiet war. 2 FBI agents were among the dead. Today, the Pine Ridge Reservation is the largest community in what may be the poorest county in the entire United States.
Together, we're going to walk up to Wounded Knee, where 50 years ago, our parents
Our relatives stood and sacrificed their lives for us. So today we could have our braids out, we could speak our language, we could have our ceremonies. We're not afraid to be who we are out in the white world.
While Pine Ridge is no longer occupied by federal troops, the war against the Lakota Nation is still ongoing. Since the major issues that triggered the occupation went unaddressed, people living on Pine Ridge suffer some of the worst living conditions in the country. Pine Ridge Reservation is a food desert, with the nearest grocery store 80 miles from it. This means that residents of the reservation have to travel 160 miles just to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. On top of this, Lakota residents of Pine Ridge face an unemployment rate of 90%. Without jobs, 97% of families live below the federal poverty line, and the average median household income ranges from $2,600 to $3,500 per year. The average life expectancy for Lakota is 47 years for men and 52 for women, far below the average national life expectancy, which is 76 years.
I felt like the spirit, the energy brought us here, you know, me, for sure. And I was looking for something, you know, to validate ourselves, you know, our own self-searching. And in a time when it wasn't good to be Indian, in my time, you know, or my youth. And so, for better or worse, you know, I realized that you have to be who you are, you know, and you should be who you are.
The federal marshals had all the high grounds, and we had bunkers and support teams down here in the middle, and trading post was over here in our security headquarters. And so it's all gone now. You know what strikes me about it is as soon as it ended, the federal people came in and they bulldozed all the main structures and buildings here. And I think they were trying to erase this out of history, that it would go away and people would forget about the massacre that happened originally and the rebellion that happened here again, because people haven't forgotten. And so coming back here, I think, is a way of rebuilding that struggle and the structures and the fight that took place here to keep the memory alive and to care for future generations. And so this is a real strong statement, I think, today, everybody being here for the 50th anniversary, the ones of us that are still around.
These individuals were intimately connected with organizations now known to have been in the pay of the United States Central Intelligence Agency.
I feel directly inspired by the 200-year record of feminism. I think that there is no backlash right now to feminism, but rather to Gloria Steinem's brand of Betty Crocker feminism. And I think the New York media in particular has been utterly servile to the Gloria Steinem brand of feminism.
Everybody's always asking me about her, you know, what kind of girl is she? She seems like a real bitch. Oh, she must be very aggressive and pushy. You know, they have these whole preconceived ideas of girl who gets to where Gloria is in life, what one has to do.
Then there are other people who say, well, Gloria's a star, not a writer. A lot of people say that. A lot of people talk about her star instinct, that she's always just slightly too far ahead in any avant-garde movement. There are people who just make simple fun, like Al Capp, who called her the Shirley Temple of the New Left.
Do you remember the East Berlin Youth Festival of 1951, when 26,000 young people from 104 countries massed to salute the heroic North Korean army for its struggle against the American imperialist aggressors? And when Harry Truman showed up on propaganda posters as a brand new Adolf Hitler? Or do you remember the Moscow extravaganza of 1957? 100,000 young people, many of them future leaders of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, gathering at the fountainhead of communism to celebrate such gala occasions as Hiroshima Day and Anti-Colonialism Day. For 6 successive youth festivals, the Kremlin did all of the talking, and the people who paid for the fireworks made sure they turned out the proper shade of red. But then something changed in Vienna in 1959. The person most responsible for that first partial scatter-shot Western success at the Vienna Festival was a young student leader named Gloria Steinem. Her independent research service helped bring those freewheeling young Americans to Vienna. Now Miss Steinem reveals that her work at Vienna and later at the Helsinki Youth Festival of 1962 was secretly paid for by the Central Intelligence Agency. And in fact, somewhere amid that tangle of CIA philanthropies, you'll find a 1962 Independence Foundation grant to the Independent Research Service for $125,000.
Gloria, at the festival you worked for the Independent Research Service.
That's right.
Well, exactly when did your own association with the CIA start, and in what fashion? Did they come to you, or did you go to them?
In 1958, when I came home from India, I discussed with student leaders, past and present, many of them active with the National Student Association, this kind of small foundation to encourage Americans to go. They thought it was a good idea, too. I was then told by foundations and professors and friends that I should not do this, that I would get in trouble with the House Un-American Activities Committee, the American Legion, all of those 50s people. And I became convinced that it was impossible. It was at that point that the student leaders said to me that they had in the past received funds for international programs from the CIA, and that they felt that this was important and could also be partly funded by the CIA.
Well, I mean, did you feel that you really tried? I mean, did you go around to all of the wealthy private foundations, wealthy private people, and explain your point of view, and explain why you felt it was important that the United States be represented at these things in a certain way? What did they tell you?
They told me that, well, the Ford Foundation, for instance, told me that they thought we were too liberal and too controversial, and that we would endanger their cultural programs in Austria. And the first festival was being held in Vienna. It was not encouraging at all. And the private individuals to whom I went often had particular points of view to put forward, which would have been much, much more restricting than the CIA funds were, which were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
You mean they were free? You mean to say it was easier for you to work for the CIA than a private organization?
That's right. And the reason I think that comes as a surprise, as it did to me at the time. I mean, I had the conventional liberals' view of the CIA as a right-wing incendiary group, and I was amazed to discover that this was far from the case, that they were enlightened, liberal, nonpartisan activists of the sort who characterized the Kennedy administration, for instance.
You have not been working now for the CIA since 1962. You still criticize. You were down recently in Washington?
Yes, when the story broke that I had once been, that I had for 4 years been a Central Intelligence agent, I was demonstrating outside the Pentagon underneath Mr. McNamara's office against bombing in Vietnam. And this didn't precisely fit with the image of a CIA agent, but then neither does the CIA.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, quietly bankrolling worthy projects.
There are notable discrepancies in Steinem's official origin story. In 1959, the so-called Independent Service for Information was set up at Harvard, coincidentally while Pottinger was a student at the university. The program was created to target European youth attending the Vienna Youth Festival with anti-communist propaganda designed, supplied and delivered secretly by the CIA. To achieve this goal, the agency required the participation of youth leaders who were well-traveled and capable of persuading young people that communism was the enemy. Steinem is even mentioned in Hugh Wilford's critically important historical masterpiece, The Mighty Wurlitzer, which covers the creation of the CIA and much of its early leadership and development. In a chapter entitled Students, Wilford writes, "It was the fall of 1958, and like many educated young women of her generation, Gloria Steinem was having difficulty finding a rewarding job. dazzlingly bright and talented, just returned from a year-and-a-half-long scholarship trip to India, which he met and befriended Indira Gandhi and the widow of revolutionary humanist M.N. Roy, the 24-year-old Smith graduate was reduced to sleeping on the floors of friends' apartments as she hunted for work in New York. Then came the call from Clive S. Gray, a young man she had met in Delhi, where he was ostensibly working on a doctoral dissertation about the Indian higher education system. Not only was it clear that the ISI was a CIA operation, Steinem soon discovered this fact for herself after asking about the funding for the project, with Wilford writing, Lund, Sigmund and Bebchik were all working directly for the CIA when they organized the ISI. So too was Gray, whose real purpose in India was talent spotting potential agents in the student movement. As for Steinem herself, she became witting when she began asking questions about the ISI's funding, and the undercover CIA officers explained that the Boston grandees and foundations apparently subsidizing the venture were in fact pass-throughs for secret official funds.
Listen, I wonder if you can help me. I want a girl. Yeah, well, I know we all do, yes.
My name is Hugh Hefner, and I'm editor-publisher of Playboy magazine.
I worked as a Playboy bunny in order to write an expose of what the working conditions were.
I started with a personal investment of $600. In 8 years, I've built an empire worth $20 million.
Was being presented as a glamorous place. It was not the glamorous place that Hugh Hefner was trying to sell it as.
You were a bunny girl for a while, an undercover bunny girl.
Yeah. To write a story, I changed my name and went to. I thought I would get through, a few auditions and write about the auditions, but they were so desperate for people that it kept going on, and I ended up working off and on for about a month. I read all the ads, that you were supposed to get $300 a week, and it was this, wonderful job. I was hired, but I had to go through the training course, which is at your own expense.
Reverse! Oh, here we go. All right, fast. Okay, now real high carry. Oh, there we go. Whoa!
It was horrible. There was nothing fun about it. It's really hard work. You're carrying trays, you have 3-inch high heels on, you're paid very little, the trays are heavy, your feet hurt. I learned of what it's like to be hung on a meat hook. That's the emotional experience of walking around in a costume that's so tight it would give a man a cleavage. The response to the article was amazing because the club was new then, and it was kind of blowing the whistle on the glamour of the club. I regretted for many years having done it because it made me unserious. But as feminism began to dawn on my brain belatedly in life, I became glad I did it. It became chic to be against the war in Vietnam, which is unfortunate because it's a legitimate issue, perhaps the most legitimate issue of our day. And it seems that everybody who's over about 25, who's in the least intellectual or has any intellectual pretensions, is violently against the war. I'm afraid frequently just because it is chic to be against the war.
It's a long trip from a wrong side of the tracks childhood in the Midwestern United States to a celebrity-studded charity ball held recently in New York, an event she only reluctantly attended. And the irony of eating caviar for the benefit of the starving doesn't escape her, but as she says, it pays the bills for a political campaign or the bail money for political activists.
Do you think that you'll ever get married?
Well, I think that's a question that's hard to answer because it depends what we mean by marriage. I guess you mean legally.
Hey, how come you never got married?
Just lucky, but no,
Gloria Steinem eventually found being asked the same question irritating. She told one reporter in 1983, "I've had a new burst of the why aren't you married questions," she told People magazine. "In fact, I've been seeing Stan Pottinger, someone I met because he was a civil rights lawyer, for more than 8 years, but I have no desire to get married. I'm very happy the way I am." The following year, Stan Pottinger's central role in the Iran Contra scandal was made public. and Gloria Steinem and Stan Pottinger parted ways. Steinem then started a relationship with billionaire industrialist Mort Zuckerman.
What is Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and the rest, what have they done that's worthwhile? What do you owe them a debt for?
Well, first of all, my feminism precedes either of them, okay? I am on the record back in the 1950s as having made these eccentric transsexual gestures at the age of 5, 6, and 7. All right, so I owe them nothing, okay? I owe them nothing. But Betty Friedan I admire very much. I'm sorry that she has made some rude remarks about me because the current feminism establishment has shunned her. She is shunned, okay? And there are many overlaps between Betty Friedan's views and mine. She is the mother of the modern movement. She founded NOW, and the drift of NOW away from Betty Friedan is, to me, the whole source of the problem. Gloria Steinem is a cliquish, power-mad, all right, snobbish elitist who has gotten the New York media in a stranglehold, all right, and essentially Gloria Steinem does not speak for all of feminism, and now does not speak for all of women, all right, and that has to stop, all right. For Gloria Steinem to go on comparing me to a Nazi, etc., etc., I mean, it's just unbelievable. The suppression of independent voices like mine for the last 20 years, all right, is appalling. Current feminism is in a Stalinist phase, a Kremlin phase. Susan Faludi, Naomi Wolf are merely clones of the Kremlin. What I represent is again, a feminism that precedes the current movement and that many people feel more at ease with. I'm someone Gloria Steinem's record with men is rotten, okay? She has made many poor choices. I've never lived with a man, okay? I have fought with men. I fight with men constantly. I never let men take advantage of me, and so because...
Let me interrupt. That may be an interesting fact of your life, that you've never lived with a man or you fought with a man.
Correct.
But I don't see where that gives you a better credential than Gloria Steinem, who may, I don't know her personal history that well, who may have had disappointing relationships with men, if in fact that's the case.
No. Here's the relevance. Marilyn French and Gloria Steinem, these women who, or Karen DeCrow, former head of NOW, these women who were weak toward men, okay, and made bad mistakes, then glommed onto this current feminist ideology to explain to themselves and to others what happened. Well, it wasn't me, it was him. I have never been weak toward men. That's why I don't blame men. My anger toward men, my confrontationalism with men is overt. It's out there, okay? I don't need this brand of feminism to explain weakness, because I'm not weak. I don't need the approval of men. There's no man in the world that I cater to, okay? So what I'm saying is these white middle-class women love this current brand of ideology because it allows them to explain their own weaknesses to the world. You see, it wasn't me. It wasn't me at all. It was the patriarchy and all that crap. These words like patriarchy, which are meaningless, big fuzz words. All right? You know, I'm popping a lot of balloons, and that's one of them.
The Incredible Hulk, a Marvel comic book superhero, recently attended a radical chic party in the company of Tom Wolfe, which set us to wondering if other members of New York's pop society might not make good comic book superheroes. How about Gloria? One of our creative kids sang out. She's beautiful and powerful and knows what's right for mankind anytime. And so, folks, Super Gloria. Strong men whimper, rich men empty their pockets, politicians buy larger socks. Gloria has but to utter the single word Shazam to save the world. Read on and wonder. Read of the origins of Superwoman. One day, while Gloria was eating her alphabet soup, the letters formed themselves into a mystical new word, Shazam. Gloria cautiously said the word, Shazam, never dreaming she would be transformed into a lithesome Lolita at Smith College. That cute Professor Humbert gave me another A. She said Shazam again and was transported to India, where she became a helpful humanitarian, spreading her gifts. Blessed are the meek. And again, becoming a fearless agent of the free world, fighting communism in Helsinki. Shazam! Take that, you rabid, raunchy, radical red. I bet George Plimpton never had to go through this. Against the warm male chauvinist pigs, our black brothers are our sisters. Right on. Gloria Steinem's life was indistinguishable from a cartoon.
More and more material is coming out, and that's why, you know, if Gloria Steinem were really making a contribution, she would tell us exactly what she did instead of lying about it. Share the information, spill the beans, and raise people's consciousness about her work for this agency. And she hasn't. She has lied again and again about it and covered it up, either by making it look better than it really was or actually covering up her involvement.
That was Kathy Sarachild talking about Gloria Steinem's connections with the CIA.
Kathy Sarachild belongs to a radical feminist group called the Red Stockings that has accused Ms. Magazine editor Gloria Steinem of having a 10-year association with the Central Intelligence Agency.
The organization, known as Red Stockings, compiled a detailed report on Steinem's relationship with the CIA. Red Stockings first released the bulk of the detailed material in the 16-page press release at the More Women in Media conference on May 9, 1975. It detailed information we had found showing that Gloria Steinem had a 10-year association with the CIA stretching from 1959 to 1969, which she had been misrepresenting, and conveyed our concerns as early movement activists that Miss Magazine and the Women's Action Alliance, another organization Steinem was instrumental in founding, were hurting the women's liberation movement. The material in the press release included the long article Gloria Steinem and the CIA, as we explained, would be part of the forthcoming theoretical journey we were publishing called Feminist Revolution, analyzing the women's liberation movement's successes and mistakes and proposing a renewed offensive. An interview on Ms. Politics and Editing, with one line censored and other scattered material from the press release, remain in Random House edition, but the main article, Gloria Steinem and the CIA, has been deleted. Random House purchased Feminist Revolution early in 1976, shortly after it was published by Red Stockings, with the intent to republish it in full. Lawyers for the publishing house saw nothing libelous in the original material. The one point they questioned in the articles on Steinem was quickly substantiated to their satisfaction. The publisher even arranged to buy from Red Stockings the original type in which the book was set. A 3-month production schedule was planned. After we had passed the libel reading and signed the contract, we were reasonably confident that the book would soon be published as it was. On October 25, 1976, Red Stockings sends Jason Epstein, now editor-in-chief at Random House, a letter inquiring about the book. On October the 27th, Epstein replies by letter saying that he had been advised by the legal department that publication of the material in Section 6, the section in which the Steinem article and others on Ms. appeared, would pose unacceptable legal risks. We are asked how we would like to proceed. However, what Kathy Sarachild and the other radical feminists of the Red Stockings didn't know is that the newly installed head of Random House, Jason Epstein, was in fact a friend of Gloria Steinem's then boyfriend, J. Stanley Pottinger. The many significant questions surrounding Gloria Steinem's relationship with the CIA continued to bother her throughout the 70s. In May 1976, New Dawn for Women magazine published an article entitled Miss Steinem, Are You Now or Have You Ever? An investigation into the connection between Gloria Steinem and the CIA by Mary Parrott Nichols. The very well-researched piece stated, Gloria Steinem has been through many changes, transformations, transmutations. This mild-mannered reporter has all her life slipped into telephone booths and emerged a new person with a new costume and a new set of beliefs. And Random House's editor, Jason Epstein, comes up again. But this time, his links to the CIA are much more pronounced. In a 1972 article in the New York Times Magazine, Merle Miller wrote of the trips which Random House editor Jason Epstein took in the early 60s at the expenses of the Fairfield Foundation, which was really the CIA. According to Miller, in Acapulco, Epstein and commentary editor Norman Podhoretz and Podhoretz's wife, Midge Decter, indulged in various anti-communist cultural activities on the beach. Jason went around introducing himself to everyone as an American spy. Epstein later wrote, the fault of the CIA was not that it corrupted innocents, but that it tried, in collusion with a group of insiders, to corner a free market. In October 2005, Stanley Pottinger was still hanging around with Jason Epstein, as noted in a short article in the Daily News entitled Safe Harbor in the Storm, which stated, Friends of Judith Miller, writer Mary Brenner, novelist and former federal prosecutor Stanley Pottinger, retired Time Inc. editor-in-chief Norman Pearlstein, and their respective spouses and date supped with the embattled New York Times reporter and her husband, Jason Epstein. Eventually, the name Epstein was to dominate Stanley Pottinger's life.
Trabajadores de mi patria, tengo fe. En Chile su destino.
sigan ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo, abrirán la grande alameda por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores!
This song was on the lips of the soldiers as they marched on the presidential palace. It happens to be a Nazi marching song. Traditionally, the armed forces have been popular in Chile. Generals and admirals have been national heroes, and traditionally, they've stayed out of politics. But when General Pinochet led his army against Allende, he believed he acted with the support of the majority of the Chilean people. His men still solemnly swear to loyally serve their country according to the established laws.
Time we were there, between 400 and 500 people were shot by firing squads in groups of 10 to 33. As 33 was the largest, 37 was the largest group that was let out to be shot inside the stadium, in the playing field itself.
At dawn, crowds still occasionally gather to view a corpse cast up by the river. Inevitably, people conclude this is part of the purge of Marxists, but Admiral Marino says no.
We don't like killing anybody. Our armed forces are for defense against enemies from abroad, not inside. On the other hand, there's not many examples of countries getting rid of communism, so we are kind of a new experience, because if Spain got rid of communism, it was through a long war. For us, it only took us 6 hours, which is a different matter. So Spain, if we took the example of Spain, well, most of the communists were killed during the war, so they didn't have it. But we do have it. So we have to convince them. And that's our multiple mission, socially, and we're doing it. We're using all the means we have, church and everything, to help us in getting these people into what they should be, just children with some nationalism, and they want to make the country happy.
Till 3 months ago, these men ruled Chile. 35 members of President Allende's government and party organization have been interned here since the coup. Among them are 13 former cabinet ministers, 4 members of Congress, and an ex-ambassador to Washington. None of them has so far been brought to trial. A naval officer remarked seriously that the bracing climate and the isolation of Dawson Island could work a spiritual cure on the prisoners. On the understanding that I did not discuss politics, I was permitted to speak briefly to 2 of the prisoners about their conditions and treatment.
The treatment from the people of the camp, yes, I would say is good. We don't have any kind of things against that. Of course, we work.
What sort of jobs are you doing?
Well, we dig holes and we put poles for electric transmission. Yeah. We make some repair in the roads. We go cutting timber and that kind of work related to the improvement of the island.
How do you spend your day?
Well, we start at 7. Later on we have coffee and bread. At 8 we start working. We work till noon. later on we have luncheon, and we start working again at about 2, and we work from 2 till 5. Then we have a cup of tea and bread. And later on, from 6 to 8, we have organized some conference among ourselves in the different specialists. We have several specialists. We have several doctors, several lawyers, several engineers here. Economists, and so on.
What do you do? What do you do?
Well, I am teaching my very poor English to other people of our group.
So what are your hopes for the next period of time?
To have lawyers and to go to trial and to clarify our legal situation.
Que esos procesos inicien, porque tenemos conciencia de no haber cometido ningún delito en relación con las leyes del país.
What we really want is to have those trials started in order, because we are absolutely convinced that we have not done anything against the law of our country.
Even though he seemed very calm when he gave the interview to the BBC Panorama team, Orlando Letelier had already been tortured. He was held in various concentration camps from his arrest, being the first high-ranking official of the Allende government to be arrested on the 11th September 1973. He would serve time at Tacna Regiment, at a military academy, and later at Dawson Island, where he would be officially a political prisoner, held with some of the high-level officials of the Allende government. International diplomatic pressure ensued, and eventually, in September 1974, Orlando Letelier was released on the strict condition that he immediately leave Chile. At first, Letelier and his family resettled in Caracas, but was soon convinced by Saul Landau to move to the United States. In 1975, he made it to Washington, D.C., a place where he eventually would be killed the following year.
The ambassador's residence is right off Sheridan Circle, maybe just a few houses down, which is where Orlando Letelier used to hang out when he was ambassador during the early years of the Allende presidency. I had a film that we had shot in Chile called Que Hacer, or What Is to Be Done. Wanted to work, of course, to bring democracy back to Chile and on human rights in general. And both Mark Raskin and Dick Barnett, who were the co-directors of IPS, thought it was a good idea. And we hired him. He didn't stay all that long because Pinochet blamed him for several of the bad things that were happening to Chile as a result of Pinochet's human rights violations. The Kennedy Amendment, which cut off all arms sales and shipments to Chile. And then the Harkin Amendment, which cut off all the rest except for humanitarian aid. And although Orlando was not responsible for either one of these, Pinochet in his narrow-shaped brain, of course, blamed him. He ordered the head of the secret police, Manuel Contreras, who was a colonel, to do the job. Contreras in turn picked Michael Townley to organize the mission. It was, I remember, a warm, slightly drizzly morning. Orlando's car came to rest just here at the embassy doorstep. Townley had put the bomb at a place in the I-beam where the bomb would blow straight up. Ronnie was sitting in the seat next to him and just took a piece of metal in the throat, and that wiped her out. I've just felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow and sadness, but I also felt that we have got to get the people who did this. And there was no question in my mind that the only possible suspect was named Augusto Pinochet. But Pinochet never got his name on that indictment with the signature of the U.S. attorney. And that was a tragic blow to American justice.
In 1975, Colonel Manuel Contreras, chief of the Chilean secret police, organized the first inter-American meeting on national intelligence. This was a covert meeting where security delegates from Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay signed up for a new intelligence sharing arrangement designed to track subversives and persons of interest. Brazil joined in 1976, followed by Ecuador and Peru 2 years later. In addition to sharing information, the accords also allowed for agents of one country to operate easily in another. This meant that people could be tracked and captured easily even after fleeing their country, and could be subjected to torture and violence without any sense of protection or asylum. While Operation Condor was not a US program, declassified documents show it undeniably had the backing of the US. The US was equally paranoid about Latin America becoming a base for left-wing uprisings, and the brutality of Operation Condor was a convenient and effective method of containment. The Condor program existed during both the Nixon-Ford and Carter administrations. The Nixon-Ford administration directly financed and armed many of the dictatorships involved. The US also directly trained many officials who went on to create the Condor system at the US Army School of the Americas training camp in Panama, where they were taught counterinsurgency tactics. The US also provided communication support, which was crucial to the operation of the Condor program. There is no question that the US had full knowledge of the scope and brutality of what was taking place. Operation Condor began to collapse in the late 70s after the assassination of Orlando Letelier, a Chilean diplomat close to Salvador Allende. US President Jimmy Carter pressured the Chilean regime to curb its repressive tactics, while Chile and Argentina began fighting over control of the Beagle Channel in 1977. The conflict, which nearly led to war, also began to create fractures between other dictatorships. But the end of the Condor program did not spell an end to political repression and violence in the region. The different regimes' agents and police continued to cooperate to kidnap, murder, and torture people for years to come. The Condor program resulted in an estimated 50,000 killed, 30,000 disappeared, and up to 400,000 arrested and imprisoned.
Newly declassified documents obtained by the National Security Archive show that on September 21, 1976, only 5 days before a car bomb planted by agents of Chile's Augusto Pinochet regime rocked downtown Washington, D.C., Secretary of State Henry Kissinger rescinded instructions sent to U.S. ambassadors in South America to warn military leaders there against orchestrating a series of international murders. The declassified material has revived questions about Kissinger's role in the secret program of international assassinations by right-wing South American dictators against leftist opponents known as Operation Condor, a program in which the United States is said to have played a supervisory and intelligence-sharing role. A cable sent by Kissinger's office from Zambia, where he was traveling at the time, to his Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Harry Schlaudeman, reads that Kissinger, quote, has instructed that no further action be taken on this matter. The matter in question concerned instructions sent under Kissinger's name to U.S. ambassadors to Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay to make a formal warning to the leaders of their host governments regarding Washington's deep concern about reports it had received of, quote, plans for the assassination of subversives, politicians, and prominent figures, both within the national borders of certain southern cone countries and abroad. The cable ordered the ambassadors to warn to the highest possible officials that such plans would, quote, create a most serious moral and political problem. Only a few days after Kissinger blocked the warning, a massive Operation Condor car bomb murdered former Chilean Foreign Minister Orlando Letelier and his 26-year-old American colleague Ronnie Moffat in Washington, D.C. The National Security Archive's Peter Kornblau said, quote, the Kissinger cancellation and warning the Condor nations prevented the delivery of a diplomatic protest that conceivably could have deterred an act of terrorism in Washington, D.C.
By 1976 and the murder of Orlando Letelier on Embassy Row, J. Stanley Pottinger had already been central to some of the most infamous cover-ups in modern history. Watergate, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the standoff at Wounded Knee, and the Kent State Massacre each had Stanley Pottinger's fingerprints all over their official narratives. Pottinger had become the Winston Wolfe of the Nixon and Ford administrations, and this Mr. Fix-It wasn't conspiring alone. Pottinger had extremely close ties to George H.W. Bush, who was at this time the director of the CIA. When Eugene Proper began his investigation into the murder of Letelier and Moffat, he was soon linked up with the Justice Department's man for all seasons, J. Stanley Pottinger. Pottinger took Proper to CIA headquarters to discuss Operation Condor with Bush, as covered in Assassination on Embassy Row. On October the 4th, J. Stanley Pottinger, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in Eugene Proper, met with CIA Director George Bush and CIA General Counsel Anthony Lapham to hammer out a solution to the problem of CIA cooperation. Bush said the agency was willing to help if Pottinger and Proper could solve his problem about the executive order banning domestic intelligence gathering. In the course of their discussion of developments in the case, the subject to Scherer's discovery of Operation Condor came up. Bush said that if Attorney General Levy would write him a letter requesting that the CIA initiate an investigation of Operation Condor, they would have a solution to the quandary about CIA cooperation. The existence of an international hit squad with the capability of operating on United States turf, he said, was definitely a serious matter of national security within the realms of the CIA's mandate. He foresaw no legal problem in turning over to the FBI the byproducts of such a CIA effort. Over the next few days, Pottinger arranged for the presidential order, and he and Proper ironed out the details of a Justice CIA agreement for secret circumscribed cooperation. The CIA would provide relevant information from CIA files, but Justice could not use the information in court unless it had independently obtained it from a separate source. In case the outcome of an investigation turned on a particular piece of CIA information or a CIA witness, the decision to use the information would be made by the president. Proper felt more than satisfied. He was impressed. He had become a member of a very special club.
Can I tell you a little story? Please. When I came here, one journalist said, anybody dumb enough to accept the job is too dumb to do it. He got a great laugh from people because it's kind of a funny line, let's face it. But God, I said to myself, how sad for our country when we're facing some tough opposition in this world to take such a cynical view of intelligence in the 1976 time. You know, he got his laugh, and I got my little hurt inside from it, but it made me determined that I'm going to approach this job with pride, and they can have all the jokes they want on television about the CIA. It's vital to the national security of the United States. And I feel so dedicated and strongly about it that I just wanted to wedge that in, apropos of no question you've asked. How long are you going to stay? I serve at the pleasure of the president. I understand that. How long are you going to stay? I'm going to stay as long as the president wants me to stay. There's no politics in this thing for me. Good heavens. You'd have to be hallucinating to think there was any political mileage in this kind of a job.
4 years ago this month, a Democrat they called Jimmy Who went into his party's precinct caucuses in Iowa, and, well, you know the rest of that story. In 8 days, a Republican they called George Who will go into his party's Iowa caucuses hoping to repeat Jimmy Carter's success story. This Republican's biggest problem, besides a lack of recognition, is that some people say he's just too nice to be president. But although it would take a minor miracle for anyone to take the nomination away from Ronald Reagan at this point, it's been said that if anyone can do it, he can. Who is he? He is George Bush. 55 years old, Phi Beta Kappa from Yale, Navy combat pilot in World War II, a Connecticut Yankee who moved to Texas and made a fortune in the oil business, former congressman from Houston, former ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Republican Party during Watergate, former envoy to China, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
J. Stanley Pottinger had been working behind the scenes for the Republican Party from at least 1967. This is how he met his good friend George H.W. Bush. In 1977, Pottinger left government service. It's here where his ties to the CIA grew. After all, within a few years, he'll be running guns with Jeffrey Epstein.
shaping a great reset for the post-corona era.